March 31st, 1922. The Bavarian countryside lies, shrouded in an unseasonably cold mist, as dawn breaks over the isolated farmstead of Hinterkaifeck. Located roughly 70 kilometers north of Munich, this remote property sits like a forgotten island in a sea of dense forest and rolling hills. The nearest neighbor is over a kilometer away. On a quiet morning like this, you could scream at the top of your lungs, and no one would hear you. But this morning, there is no screaming. There are no sounds of daily life emanating from the farm buildings. No smoke rises from the chimney. The livestock stand unfed in their stalls, lowing pitifully. The chickens scratch desperately in their empty coop. Something is terribly, horribly wrong at Hinterkaifeck. What investigators are about to discover will become one of the most brutal and baffling murder cases in German criminal history. A case so disturbing that it will haunt Bavaria for generations. A case involving 6 victims, including 2 young children, slaughtered with an axe by a killer who may have been living in their home for days before striking. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, a century-old mystery that remains unsolved to this day, and one that will make you question whether you ever truly know who might be watching you from the shadows of your own home. The discovery Lorenz Schlittenbauer had been growing increasingly worried about his neighbors, the Gruber family. As a local farmer and longtime friend of Andreas Gruber, patriarch of the Hinterkaifeck farm, Schlittenbauer knew their routines intimately. Andreas was a creature of habit before dawn, tending to his animals, going about his daily chores with Germanic precision. But for the past 4 days, Schlittenbauer hadn't seen any signs of activity at the farm. The mail hadn't been collected. Smoke hadn't been rising from the chimney, even during the cold March nights. Most tellingly, Andreas had failed to appear at the local tavern for his regular evening beer, something he had done religiously for decades. On this Friday morning, Schlittenbauer decided he could wait no longer. Accompanied by 2 other neighbors, Michael Peen and Jakob Sigel, he made the journey to the isolated farmstead to check on the Gruber family. As their cart approached the main farmhouse, the 3 men immediately noticed the eerie silence. No dogs barked to announce their arrival. No voices called out from the fields or barns. The whole property felt abandoned, as if life itself had simply stopped. Schlittenbauer called out for Andreas. His voice echoed off the barn walls and disappeared into the morning mist. No response came back. The men began searching the property systematically. In the barn, they found the livestock in distress and fed and unwatered for days. But it was when they ventured behind the main house, toward the machine shed, that they made their first horrifying discovery. Partially covered by hay and farm equipment, they found the bodies of 4 people, stacked like cordwood in a grotesque pile. Andreas Gruber, 63 years old, lay at the bottom. On top of him was his wife, Cecilia, aged 72. Above her was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35. And finally, at the top of the macabre pile, was Victoria's 7-year-old daughter, Cecilia, nicknamed Chiselia after her grandmother. All 4 had been brutally murdered with what appeared to be a farming tool, most likely a mattock, a type of pickaxe commonly used for breaking up soil. Their skulls had been crushed with tremendous force, and the scene was soaked in blood that had long since dried to a dark, rusty brown. But the horror was far from over. Rushing into the main house, the men discovered 2 more victims. In an upstairs bedroom, they found the family's maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had been working at the farm for only 4 days. She had been killed in her bed, also with blows from the same farming tool. And in another room, they found the most heartbreaking victim of all, two-year-old Joseph, Victoria's youngest son, lying in his crib with his tiny skull crushed. 6 people, 6 innocent lives snuffed out with savage brutality. An entire family and their young maid murdered by an unknown killer who had disappeared without a trace into the Bavarian wilderness. The investigation begins when the police arrived at Hinterkaifeck. They found themselves confronting a crime scene unlike anything they had encountered before. The methodical nature of the killings, the careful positioning of the bodies, and, most disturbing of all, the evidence that the killer had remained at the farm 4 days after the murders. All of it pointed to something far more sinister than a simple robbery gone wrong. Inspector Georg Riengruber of the Munich police took charge of the investigation. What he discovered in those first crucial hours would puzzle criminologists for the next century. The crime scene told the story of calculated violence and chilling composure. The 4 victims found in the machine shed had been lured there one by one, most likely under some pretext by someone they knew and trusted. There were no signs of a struggle in the main house, suggesting that the family had been killed before they realized they were in danger. But here's where the case becomes truly disturbing. Evidence indicated that the killer had not fled immediately after committing the murders. Instead, he had remained at the farm for several days, living among the corpses, eating the family's food, tending to their animals, and even building fires in the stove to keep warm. Neighbors later recalled seeing smoke coming from the farmhouse chimney in the days following what investigators determined was the night of the murders, March 31st, 1922. The killer had been there, going about daily routines as if nothing had happened, while 6 bodies lay decomposing just meters away. The police found evidence of the killer's extended stay throughout the house. Food had been consumed from the family's stores. Bread had been freshly baked. The animals had been fed and watered. Someone had been living a normal domestic life while surrounded by the evidence of mass murder. Most chilling of all, investigators found signs that the killer may have been living secretly at the farm even before the murders occurred. The strange events before the murders, as investigators dug deeper into the case, they uncovered a series of deeply unsettling incidents that had occurred in the weeks and months leading up to the murders. Andreas Gruber had confided to several neighbors about strange occurrences around the farm that had left him increasingly paranoid and frightened. 6 months before the murders, Andreas had discovered footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the forest to his house, but no footprints leading away. Someone had approached his home under cover of darkness and apparently never left. How was that possible? Andreas had also reported hearing footsteps in the attic late at night, walking back and forth above his bedroom. When he investigated, he found nothing, but the sounds continued night after night. He began to suspect that someone was living in the cramped space above his ceiling, coming and going through an access point he couldn't locate. Even more disturbing, Andreas had noticed that tools and small items around the farm were going missing, only to reappear in different locations days later. Keys would vanish from their hooks and be found in completely different buildings. Personal belongings would be moved from room to room overnight. The family's previous maid had quit abruptly just days before Maria Baumgartner arrived, claiming that the house was haunted and refusing to explain further. When pressed by Andreas, she would only say that she felt like she was being watched constantly and that she had heard voices in the house when the family was away. Perhaps most tellingly, Andreas had found a newspaper on his property that he had never purchased, dated from Munich and containing news that no one in his isolated rural area would have had access to. Someone with connections to the outside world had been visiting his farm regularly. All of these incidents pointed to a terrifying conclusion. The killer had been stalking the Gruber family for months, possibly living secretly in their home, learning their routines, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The investigation intensifies. Inspector Riengruber assembled one of the largest investigation teams in Bavarian history. More than 100 suspects were interviewed, ranging from local farmers and traveling workers to distant relatives and business associates of the Gruber family. The investigation revealed several potential motives for the murders, but none that seemed to fully explain the methodical brutality of the crime or the killer's bizarre behavior afterward. One theory centered on family secrets and potential blackmail. Victoria Gabriel, the widowed daughter, had been having an affair with her own father, Andreas, and had given birth to 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph, who were likely the products of this incestuous relationship. In conservative 1920s Bavaria, such a scandal could destroy reputations and lead to social ostracism or even criminal charges. Investigators theorized that someone had discovered this dark family secret and was either blackmailing Andreas or planning to expose him. The murders could have been committed to silence potential witnesses or to exact revenge for some perceived wrong. Another theory focused on financial motives. Andreas Gruber, despite his isolated lifestyle, was actually quite wealthy. He owned substantial property, had money hidden throughout the farmhouse, and was involved in several business dealings that had made him enemies. Perhaps someone had killed the family during a robbery that had gone horribly wrong. But the most disturbing theory, and the one that investigators found most compelling, was that the killer was someone who knew the family intimately, someone who had been watching them, learning their habits, and planning the murders meticulously. The fact that the victims had been lured to the machine, shed one by one, suggested that they trusted their killer. The fact that the killer had remained at the farm for days afterward suggested either complete madness or a level of familiarity with the property that only someone who had been there before could possess. The prime suspects. Over the course of the investigation, several suspects emerged who seemed to fit the profile of the Hinterkaifeck killer. The first was Lorenz Schlittenbauer himself, the neighbor who had discovered the bodies. Investigators found his behavior at the crime scene suspicious. When he first entered the house and found the bodies, he had reportedly disturbed the scene, moving items around and even picking up some of the victims before the police arrived. Schlittenbauer claimed he was simply checking to see if anyone was still alive. The investigators wondered if he was actually removing evidence that could implicate him. They also discovered that Schlittenbauer had been having an affair with Victoria Gabriel and was likely the father of her youngest son, Joseph. This gave him a potential motive related to the family's complicated sexual dynamics. However, Schlittenbauer had solid alibis for the night of the murders and was well regarded in the community. Despite suspicions, investigators could never build a convincing case against him. The second major suspect was Victoria's estranged husband, Carl Gabriel. Although he had been declared dead during World War I, there were rumors that he had actually survived and was living under an assumed identity. Some investigators theorized that Carl had returned to kill his wife and her family in a fit of rage over her incestuous relationship with her father. This theory gained traction when investigators discovered that someone matching Carl's description had been seen in the area in the weeks before the murders. However, despite extensive searches, they were never able to locate Carl Gabriel or prove that he was still alive. The third suspect was a mysterious vagrant known only as the woodcutter, who had been seen in the area around the time of the murders. Several witnesses reported encounters with a strange man carrying an axe, who had been asking for work at local farms. This man had disappeared immediately after the murders and was never identified or located. The dead ends, despite the massive investigation, the case gradually went cold. The Bavarian police followed hundreds of leads, interviewed countless suspects, and even consulted with early criminal psychologists, but they were unable to identify the killer definitively. Part of the problem was the crime scene itself. In 1922, forensic science was still in its infancy. There was no DNA testing, no sophisticated fingerprinting techniques, and no psychological profiling. Investigators had to rely on witness testimony, physical evidence, and intuition tools that proved inadequate for solving such a complex case. The passage of time also worked against the investigation. By the time police arrived at Hinterkaifeck, the crime scene had been contaminated by the neighbors who discovered the bodies. Critical evidence may have been destroyed or moved before investigators could properly document it. Perhaps most frustratingly, the killer's decision to remain at the farm for days after the murders had actually worked in his favor. By the time the bodies were discovered, Any trace evidence that might have led to his identification had been obscured by his continued presence at the scene. The legacy of fear, the Hinterkaifeck murders, sent shockwaves through rural Bavaria that lasted for decades. Isolated farmers began barricading their doors at night and traveling in groups for protection. The idea that someone could live secretly in your home, watching your every move while planning your murder, tapped into primal fears that still resonate today. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of rural families in an era before modern communication and transportation. The Gruber family's isolation, which they had probably seen as a source of security and independence, had actually made them perfect targets for a predator who could stalk them without fear of discovery. In 1923, exactly 1 year after the murders, the farmstead was demolished and the land sold. No one wanted to live in a place where such horror had occurred. Today, a memorial stands on the site, marking the location where 6 innocent people lost their lives to an unknown killer who vanished into the Bavarian forest and was never seen again. Conclusion: the monster next door. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Germany's most disturbing unsolved cases, not just because of their brutality, but because of what they reveal about the thin line between safety and terror in our daily lives. The killer wasn't a stranger who appeared from nowhere to commit random violence. He was someone who had been watching, waiting, and planning for months. Someone who may have been living in the victim's own home, sharing their space while plotting their destruction. The case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The monsters we fear most are yet the ones who strike from the shadows and disappear. They are the ones who hide in plain sight, who learn our routines, who gain our trust, and who turn our most sacred spaces, our homes, into crime scenes. A century later, the Hinterkaifeck murders continue to haunt not just Bavaria, but anyone who has ever wondered whether they're truly alone in their house at night. They remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it creeps into our lives so gradually, so carefully, that we don't recognize it until it's too late. The 6 victims of Hinterkaifeck, Cecilia, Victoria, little Cecilia, baby Joseph, and Maria Baumgart, not to see the statistics in an unsolved case, but as real people who lived, loved, and died in circumstances so horrific that they still challenge our understanding of human evil. Their killer may have escaped earthly justice, but their story serves as an eternal warning about the predators who walk among us, the dangers that lurk in isolation, and the importance of staying connected to our communities and vigilant about our safety. In the end, the Hinterkaifeck murders teach us that the most terrifying histories aren't always the ones involving supernatural forces or impossible circumstances. Sometimes the most frightening cases are the ones that could happen to any of us in any isolated place when we least expect it. The monster of Hinterkaifeck was real, human, and utterly ruthless. And somewhere in the Bavarian countryside, his secret died with him, leaving only questions that will echo through eternity.